And the copy machines in some of these modern offices really are. I like the idea of him being kind of a coffee addict, and then because I made her a waitress to beginning, I thought, what's something she can fix immediately? In the original Jane Eyre, she's like, well, get on your horse and bring the horse over, and she's immediately that competency. And so I thought, what's the competency of a woman whose life has been very restricted to the restaurant she works? Well, she knows coffee machine. So then I just had to make it the most malfunctioning coffee machine possible that would physically injure him in some way.
That's so good.
Well, hello there, Lillian. How are you?
I'm good, Piper. How are you?
I'm doing very good. I'm always in such a good mood whenever we have an extra person joining us and we get to talk with somebody else about our love for Jane Eyre and all the things associated with that.
We have an extra person joining us. I act as if it's a surprise. That's so exciting. I also love that. It's really good because I read a whole book today and I was hoping to get a chance to talk to the author about it. And then she showed up on our call. How convenient.
Oh my God, amazing. So hi, Melody. How are you? Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on the show.
Our pleasure. Thanks for being here and for sharing your book with us.
Yes, we were very excited. You were one of the authors who was suggested to us the most to read your book. It's called Jane and Edward, and it is a modern reimagining of Jane Eyre, which we will be talking about the same way we talk about all our books, with a pre-spoiler and then a post-spoiler section. But first of all, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Melodie Edwards. I'm Canadian. I'm from Toronto. I love Jane Eyre, so I'm thrilled to be here. I did a literature degree at the University of Toronto. I went into a career in corporate communications. I'm just finishing my master's degree in communications. In 2020, I sat down and I wrote Jane and Edward. Sent that off to an agent, and it sort of went from there, and now I have a book out and a second book coming, and I get to be on great podcasts like this.
Yay! We're so excited to have you.
So we like to start, one way to kind of get everyone on the same playing field when it comes to talking about Jane Eyre is to ask our guests, what was your introduction to this story? And if you happen to have a favorite adaptation of said story, apart from the one that you've written, please tell us about that too.
You can say yours if you want to just say yours.
No, I've got a favorite. So I'm actually struggling to remember when I first encountered Jane Eyre because I've reread it so many times now. I think I was probably 17 or 18, and I'm pretty sure I had already seen the Timothy Dalton adaptation because we love those old BBC adaptations and things like that in my household. It was right up there with the 1995 Pride and Prejudice. And then I think I got my hands on a book. I know what the copy of the book looks like. I have many copies now, but I can still picture it. It was a little hardcover, dark blue, very thin pages, and the pages were always tearing. I loved it, and I think there was something special about encountering Jane Eyre, being close to the age she is through a lot of the novel at 18, 19 area. And I just adored it, and I read it over and over and over again. But my favorite adaptation, Timothy Dalton, is I think it's 2007 ITV, Ruth Wilson and Toby Stephens. Because they gave it the time to go through it properly. They had all those conversations. Toby Stephens is not what I would picture physically from Mr. Rochester, but she embodied the spirit of it, and I love everything Ruth Wilson's in. She's a perfect Jane Eyre. I'm a big fan of the Mia Wasikowska one that came out a number of years later. Beautifully shot. My only bugaboo with that one is I feel like it's more like a music video for Jane Eyre in that you have beautiful sweeping scenes and perfect music and perfect costumes, and you don't get the conversations that make up so much of Jane Eyre, so much of the dialogue, which I love. So the Toby Stephens, Ruth Wilson one wins for me every time.
Amazing. There's a whole army of fans who would agree with you on that one.
Yeah. Those are definitely, you hit upon a lot of people's favorites for sure. You saw Piper's reaction that I simply must recount for our listeners, which is as soon as she said Timothy Dalton, Piper gave her 2 thumbs up and was like, aha, you have good taste. We can tell.
Yes, yes. Well, that was my intro. So anytime I meet a fellow person who's like, "Oh yeah, I saw this one and it made me think," and I'm like, "We have something to talk about."
Oh yeah, Timothy Dalton as Rochester was just beautiful.
Yes.
Oh yes, very much so.
I do think it's funny that you mentioned the age that you encountered it, because I feel like all of our listeners know how my age when I encountered it changed the way I think about it, because I was 27, almost 10 years older than Jane. And I was like, what is going on with this man? Why is he hitting on a teenager? This is so creepy. Which is not the intended reaction.
No.
No, it does change a bit. I mean, I'm in my 30s now, and I'm like, wow, there's a lot of red flags on this guy. But when you're 17 and you kind of have that new to the world feeling that Jane has, everything's just like, oh, what's going on here?
Mm-hmm, for sure.
Absolutely. So I noticed in the back of your book, Melodie, you mentioned that you wrote a lot of this kind of during the pandemic. I would love, I think, to start, let's maybe go into sort of like where you were thinking about, I want to write a novel. Why was a reimagining of Jane Eyre kind of where you landed?
I always did a bit of creative writing growing up. When I was in high school and university, I wrote plays, I wrote short films, I wrote for the student paper. And then when I moved into my communications career, it was a career that had a lot of writing, which I love, but a very different kind of writing. I work in the financial sector. So I was writing press releases and speeches for people and briefing memos and that sort of thing. And I kind of put all that creative writing on the side, and I dabbled every now and again with like contests and stuff like that, but I kind of just put it to the side. And when the pandemic happened, all of us were at home. A lot of us were working remotely. Those of us who were fortunate enough to be safe and at home and have our jobs, but had a lot of spare time on my hands. And I thought, well, this pandemic could go on for a good long while. So I'd had for a long time this idea of a Jane Eyre modern adaptation in my head. And it was really born of going to work in the financial sector, because it was, again, and I was like 22 when I started this career. So I was going up into very, very tall towers in Toronto's version of Wall Street, which is Bay Street. And it was all kind of this magical world. Again, we talk about being a certain age and everything's just kind of new and you wide-eyed. And when I'd been working there for a while, I just kind of thought, there's a very clear class structure in some of these organizations that I work for that you don't kind of see in your everyday walking around. And I rather thought that kind of works for Jane Eyre. And, there's multi-floors for this one office tower, but you're way up high in the sky. And there's all kinds of ecosystems for who works where and who does what, and the bosses versus the supporting staff. And I honestly kept picturing, I think I put this in my opening letter in the beginning of the book, I kept picturing Jane Eyre sitting in one of those cubicles I walked by and Mr. Rochester shouting for her from one of the partners' offices. So that had been sitting in my head for years and years and years. And so when the pandemic happened and I thought, I need a project to fill the time, I'm like, I'm going to sit down and write things. And so I did. And I saw, what precipitated too was, I saw an article that said, romance novels were flying off the shelf in the beginning of the pandemic. And I think that makes sense because it's lovely and escapism and romantic, and so many people were isolated and at home. And so I thought, I'm going to make this Jane Eyre heavily on the romance factor, but putting it in this strange ecosystem that I've been working in for so long, which is now was completely shut down for the pandemic, right? All those office towers were shut down. Mm. So it was sort of like a goodbye letter as well to that world. And so with the time I had, pandemic time, I sat down and I think I wrote about 2,000 words a day for about 40 days. And at the end, I got a book.
Wow.
That's impressive.
So incredible.
Yeah. I love hearing it confirmed that a lot of this was taken from kind of like personal observation and experience, because that's something that really stood out to me when reading the book about, Jane's just perception of the world, going like on the train into the big city, navigating like the tunnel system, and like just that whole experience. So I definitely got a vibe. I was like, this feels lived in. Mm-hmm. So it's cool to hear that confirmed.
I was like, everyone mentions the tunnels. Everyone loves the underground path part. Yeah, it is very lived in. And I'm not my character, of course. Jane is Jane Eyre. But I'd worked in there I've worked in that environment for about 12 years now. So I see the new interns coming in and the newbies all coming in, that look on their face. And I'm like, that's Jane Eyre walking into Thornfield, and I'm going to capture that.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of Piper and I both, fresh out of college, worked in downtown Minneapolis, and we don't have tunnels, we have skyways. So we have a similar like maze system that is so easy to navigate when you've been doing it for a few years. But when you're fresh out of college, it feels like especially like that feeling that you captured of her putting on her fancy business outfit the first day, and you feel like you're putting on like almost a costume, and you're like, why am I play pretending being a business lady? It just was so well done.
Oh, that's great. We've all got the experience of adulting for the first time, right? And being like, they went by.
Yes. And then we just wish that we had our own Adele to be our guide.
There's a few characters that we can talk about because they're introduced in this pre-spoiler section. They're introduced so early on in the story, like Adele. But before we jump too much into that, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about generally as well, and you talked about sort of the inspiration of Thornfield as this large firm downtown Toronto versus the setting that it takes place in the book. But there's a lot of things. When I first was reading, the cover of the book calls it a reimagining versus a straight up down retelling. So the closest modern retelling that we've consumed is probably there was a YouTube series, I don't know if you saw it, in 2012, that was really trying to tell the story of Jane Eyre as closely as they could to the story, beat for beat. Where yours is very much not doing that. There's certain beats that are very, very Jane Eyre, and there's the pacing to it and other things that you can really feel that. But the characters have slightly different names. Adele is obviously not a young child that she's a governess for. But I'm curious as to how you made some of those decisions and why the reimagining versus a straight up and down retelling.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Adele is a combination of Adele and Mrs. Fairfax. I kind of smushed those two. So I really enjoy retellings. I haven't seen the web series you mentioned, although I've seen some of the web series for Pride and Prejudice and stuff that they did, I don't know, about 10 years ago, that are really quite good. They're putting them into modern settings. I enjoy retellings, but I just found it would be very difficult to do that exact beat for beat. There's so much that's difficult to translate. And I just kind of wanted more freedom. So when I looked at doing Jane Eyre, like again, the first thing that made me want to do this was I saw a setting where the character of Jane could be in modern times, and everything kind of filled itself in around that. So what I tried to do when I was planning this novel out is I took the characters I felt were the heart of it, and I kind of mapped out their emotional journeys. And then I mapped out the big events that kind of precipitated those emotional journeys, like the fire at Thornfield, getting her inheritance when she's, out with St. John Rivers and the others, like those things that move the plot along and really change the development. And so those are the ones I kept, and everything else, I kind of just let myself go where I wanted to. So I had the major events mapped out, and I was just kind of swinging from point to point and writing creatively as I went. And when I was working with my editor and we were talking about the title of this book and things like that, we agreed we needed the word reimagining rather than retelling, because there were a lot of things like the combination of Adele and Fairfax that I just kind of took liberties with. Like I felt that Adele and Fairfax both provided different things for Jane, but there's no reason those things couldn't all be provided by one character. And so it just gave me sort of more freedom, and also because there's certain things that are acceptable back in the 1800s that are not going to fly nowadays. And so the direct translation was really impossible. And so I tried to look at what comes out of it. So, in the original Jane Eyre, they have the big house party, and Jane's in this weird nebulous position when Mr. Rochester keeps inviting her in, but she's really support staff. Like she's a servant, right? So I didn't want to quite make it someone who's a servant now, but this idea of you have all these CEOs coming into the office and she's the legal secretary. So she needs to be there, but what's really her position? So any scenes I could have where her position felt weird like that, then I felt that I'd derived what I needed to from the novel without necessarily having to have a house party.
And then we did get something of a party, which I thought was handled really well too, but I don't know if we need to save that for spoiler scenes later on.
We save it for spoiler scenes.
Okay. I think one thing that we could talk about right off the bat, that isn't a spoiler, is their meet cute moment. So I'm just kind of curious to be like, because obviously there's no falling off a horse in downtown Toronto. So how did you land on the coffee machine scenario?
Yeah, that's one of those things where I was looking at the meet cute. I'm like, what is it? He's got some big disaster. He's injured. And then you immediately get his whimsical side where he's calling her a witch and a fairy and saying, you cursed the lane and made it icy. Like, what can I do with that? And then I just looked at an office setting. And the coffee machines in some of these modern offices really are confusing. You know, I also thought of doing like a printer that was malfunctioning or, you know, automatic doors that are malfunctioning or any number of those things. But I like the idea of him being kind of a coffee addict and him struggling with all technology, which is, again, a little antique touch from the original Jane Eyre. I thought people who are in these modern times, you shouldn't have tech. And then because I made her a waitress to beginning, I thought, what's something she can fix immediately? In the original Jane Eyre, you know, she's like, well, get on your horse and bring the horse over. And like, she's immediately that competency. And so I thought, what's the competency of a woman whose life has been very restricted to the restaurant she works? Well, she knows coffee machine. So then I just had to make it the most malfunctioning coffee machine possible that would physically injure him in some way.
That's so good.
I love it. And I like the adaptation of like her skill set to like make her capable in an otherwise very unfamiliar surroundings, like we've kind of talked about, where I feel like for most of that morning, she is this fish out of water, but this is one thing that she can use to be like, oh no, I have some abilities. I know what to do in this situation, and to instantly impress him in that way. One thing I was thinking about this morning too that I think is really interesting. This is just my kind of take, and I'm curious if this was like your intention. So with her beginning as working as this waitress in this restaurant, I was thinking back, especially when she's like talking to like her manager like later on in the story, and I'm like, it's interesting to think of like the previous, like in the novel, we have the kind of controlling and oppressive environments of the household of her aunt with her family. And then also, of course, why am I blanking on the school? Lowood, thank you. Of like a school like that. And I think, what an interesting way to be like, okay, what is equally oppressive and horrible? Oh, the service industry. And so like, I kind of loved that way of exploring that. And so I was wondering if that was kind of something that you also like had in mind intentionally, or thoughts on that kind of experience.
Yeah, that whole early section of Jane Eyre where she's in the oppressive household of her aunt and she's in Lowood, and then even when she's graduated Lowood, she's there as a teacher. And, you know, one of my favorite lines is where she's like, if I cannot have freedom, at least let me have a different kind of servitude, which I think a lot of us who've been in jobs that we don't love feel like the change is good as a rest, right? Give me change at least. So I wanted to kind of take that beginning and I spread it out over a couple of things. Later in the book, she goes to Lowood University, which has its own problems. So I kind of spread out that oppressive beginning. But yes, I think most of us have teenagers or university students or whatnot have had experience in the service industry. I know I have, and it's meant as no disrespect for people whose full time is in the service industry, because I know that's a lot of people. But I was just thinking of, you know, the physical repetition of it. And there's this really great national theater adaptation of Jane Eyre, and I'm gonna blank on the year and blank on the actress, but it's really fantastic. And there's an opening. You're both nodding, so I know you've seen this, right?
Yes.
There's an opening scene where they're moving windows on her all the time.
Yes.
And repetition of the schoolroom, and she's just doing the French lessons over and over and over and over again, even as a teacher. And then just kind of glimpsing these moving windows with a little bit of freedom. And so I pictured her in a restaurant, clear the table, bust the table, load the table, serve the table, clear the table, bust the table, like over and over and over again, because you don't get a lot of novelty in something like that. So I was looking for something that was physically repetitive on someone. And then what would it be? Another restaurant, just, you know, changing the menu, changing the restaurants. And like the students of Lowood, all these people she's got to serve and no time for herself. And so that's how I picked it. I was really looking for that scene from the play adaptation really stuck with me when they're making her look physically repetitive and the children reciting lessons, more so than that scene from the original book. And so that's what I was picturing in a restaurant. People calling out my bill, change the table. And I wanted that same, even though it's a book, you can't see it.
Yeah.
Realize I'm writing from a play adaptation, but I love the mood they created in that particular scene. And so that's the scene I was trying to translate by making her a waitress.
I love it.
Yeah.
And I also think it's a great environment where in a modern day setting, like a man could be kind of not mistreating her, but not treating her great, as kind of that Brocklehurst almost like insert to be like, okay, where would she be that someone would treat her this way? Oh, the service industry. Yeah, there's plenty of jerks who will treat a waitress like it's her job to wait on them more so than what is in the job description. Anyway, but...
So I know the rest of my questions are going to have spoilers. Is there anything else you want to ask Piper before we go into that?
I think I'm ready for spoiler territory.
Okay.
So
listeners,
if you guys, haven't read the book, pause, go buy it, go to your library. No, buy it, send her money. She needs pay her for this wonderful writing. Go read the book and then press play and resume for the rest of the episode.
Yeah, it is a very good read, very worth it, guys. Go read it and then come back to us. So I have most of my questions are around the way you sort of translated characters and choices that you made that are slightly different, just because we've spent the last 2 years exploring this particular story. That's always what jumps out to me when we're enjoying a new adaptation. So one that obviously we see right at the beginning that I wanted to wait to talk about until we were talking about spoilers because of how much it comes back in the end is Jane's father, and the fact that she lived with him up until she was 13 and then comes back in the end that he maybe wasn't as neglectful of the future of his daughter as we once thought. So I'm curious about what the inspiration there was and how you chose to approach that character.
Well, again, that's kind of a combination of the uncle and Madeira that she never gets to meet, and the fact that I think in the original book her father is a minister. Got that right? Am I going to screw up a detail of Jane Eyre and hang my head forever in shame?
No, you're good.
And I like that idea of, and the uncle that passed, the uncle that lives with that was married to the horrible aunt, talks about how much he loved this sister, and the aunt talks about how much he doted over her as a baby. So I read this nice kind of theme in my head of these older gentlemen who might have loved her and given her a good upbringing. There's the father that, that the mother was willing to drop social classes to marry, so we assume he was a lovely guy. There was the uncle who doted on this baby and unfortunately passed too soon and asked his wife to bring it up his own. It was the uncle out in Jamaica who said, bring her to me, I want to make her my heir. So I liked this theme of there were all these missed opportunities for Jane in the original novel to have had a loving father figure and a loving upbringing. And so what I kind of did was I smushed them all together into her father, and I gave her 13 years with her father, which I also think just for my character was important that she I didn't give her, the wealthy aunt's house. So I wanted to give her an upbringing of a different kind that she might return to later in life, that she might remember what it was nice to have creature comforts and a home over her head and stuff, which we kind of get in the original when Jane leaves, as awful as the aunt is, when she leaves a place with regular meals to go with Lowood where people are dying of illness. So I want to kind of give her that secure physical place, which was the campus of her father. And then her father stands in for all these men who might have given her an upbringing. If her father had lived, how would her life have turned out differently? In the same way in the original book, if the aunt had passed on that letter from that uncle, if she had honored her husband's wishes, how might it have all gone differently? And that's also played into that inheritance that comes in at the end from the uncle in Jamaica. I made that inheritance sort of come from her father, that there was always this intent for someone to care for Jane, and she's been thwarted at every turn. So that's one of my cases where I'm like, there's three characters. There's a theme of these men trying to help her and not being able to as she's growing up. They'll smush them all into one father and then kill them off.
Yeah.
Until that opportunity here and now.
It's, I think, one of my favorite initial scenes between Jane and Rochester, where they're kind of like getting together, or I guess I should say Edward, because he has a different name in your book, but is when his like teasing kind of goes too far, and she has that reaction about, her relationship with her father and everything like that, when he said, oh, I was like, Googling you to figure out who you were and all this stuff. And I love, it's one thing that Lillian and I have talked about a lot, is that a good Edward, in like part of like what makes him like brash and kind of like awkward for other people, is that like he does like to push buttons and stuff, but he is like respectful of people that he actually cares about. So when he sees that it's hurt Jane's feelings or he's gone too far, that's when he kind of like instantly stops. Is like, oh no, I'm so sorry. And that kind of first like moment of tenderness, or not initial, but it was one of the early ones. And I really enjoyed that moment.
I'm so glad. Yeah. Translating his character was probably the toughest because there's so much Lord of the Manor can do in the original book that you put it in the book now and people would be like, whoa, run away from this guy. So that was tough. But when I looked at Edward's character, and again, Jane Eyre, I love that you're spending 2 years on Jane Eyre because it's such a rich book. And I really feel like I could have done 3 or 4 different modern adaptations, just pulling different things out of Jane Eyre. Like I really had to cut to what I thought was important, but I'm like, I could have made the character do this and gone off into this setting, and like there's so much to get there. There's such 3D psychologically rich characters. There's so much to pull out. So for Edward, what I looked at in the original novel, and then I tried to translate that, is he says truly awful things out of his mouth all the time. But when you actually look at how he treats people, when he considers people worthy, he actually treats them very well. So he talks dismissively about the simple Dame Fairfax, but she's always said, oh no, he's been a good master, he's been a good employer, he takes care of us. And Adele, he speaks so dismissively of Adele. He doesn't even know if Adele's his, but he's given her an upbringing in school and he brings her presents. Like if you think about how Jane was treated as somebody's kind of off-cast child in a house versus how Adele is treated. And then, he's got people who genuinely like him. When Mason comes from Jamaica, he's even kind of caring of Mason. And he says, Mason's not as bad as the rest of the family. When he encounters someone he doesn't like, who he feels is sort of morally failing, like, members of the house party, then he treats them awfully. He's happy to play tricks on them. He's happy to do this on them. Mm-hmm. So I always try to look at what's the difference between what comes out of his mouth versus his actual actions with people. And you kind of get the reverse with other characters, and it's to me, it's almost like a celebrity who's like, care about the environment. Here's my private jet. You've got to separate the words from the actions to truly judge someone. Even that thing, and it was a very tricky thing to try to translate, when he tricks Jane into thinking he's going to be married. I mean, really, that's terrible gaslighting. And again, in modern parlance, we'd say, oh my gosh, how manipulative, gaslighting, horrible, like. But when you consider where it comes from, that he's in a position of power, that he's had mistresses who were just there for the pay, that he wants to make sure she genuinely loves him, his extreme gaslighting subterfuge really is to give her the freedom to declare first. So even though the method is questionable, what he says about Blanche and what he says to Jane, it's all very questionable. I try to honor the intentions, and that's how I kind of approached Edward. And that's why I had him being verbally awful in the office, but the minute he goes too far and genuinely hurts someone that he respects, he's backpedaling as fast as he can go.
Yeah. I think that was one thing that was really standing out to me, is how well, because that balance, right, of the gaslighting, the like, I can't tell you I love you first, it's inappropriate, whether it's in like the original context of the novel where it's like, well, I'm not only like your employer, but the class difference and everything. I felt an office setting, a corporate setting like this would really, it translated super well, of especially like, I think we talked about this with a couple of our other authors who have done somewhat modern retellings of talking about like, since like, especially like the Me Too movement and things like that, of being like, okay, how do I tell this without it being incredibly inappropriate or disrespectful? And so I loved when they did have their confession scene, how he addressed that, of being like, I can't tell you I love you even if I do. And so like, I had to do these things. I'm so sorry. I know it's shitty and it sucks, but this is the situation we're in. And I hope I didn't go too far, even though she's crying and it's great.
Well, and I think it's such a Rochester choice, because I do want to talk about that specific moment, that like, it's very Rochester to sort of be unaware that Jane was jealous. Like, I like that you sort of, rather than it being him bringing this character in to be jealous, like he does have like an elaborate plan with the character of Isabel in the story, but the way that he wasn't intending to make Jane jealous in this version of the story because he didn't realize that she would be until they're on the stairs. And then he's like pushing her buttons because he sees an opportunity versus it being this long plot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I tried to reduce the intentionality by not making a long con, and I've got to give full credit to my editor at Berkeley, Kate Seaver, and my agent, Melissa Edwards at Stone Song, because they were really great when I wrote those first scenes of saying, like, oh, you're approaching the wall of this not being okay, or you fell back at it. So they were really great for an objective third party to tell me what was perhaps going to be too much in modern settings. But yeah, I wanted to get that spur of the moment, oh, I can make this work, to make her jealous. But I also, I gave him that character trait to try and make up for the fact that he says awful things and does awful things by making him just so hyper focused on the work. I think we've all met people like that, particularly, academics or lawyers or just, librarians and students, when you get really into your work and the rest of the world is kind of just a blur around you. And so I made him a lawyer who's really into his work. So even when he's doing these things that are leading Jane to believe this or with that, it's really all just because he's only focused on what he's getting across in the work. And then when he looks up, he goes, oh no, I've done this. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe I can do this to get a declaration out of her and make it okay.
Which is another level of having Jane be his assistant. I love the idea too that what makes them such a great pair, both like romantically later on, but just like in general, is her ability to kind of reel him in and like be that stabling agent for him. So that like they already had that connection before, like the romantic sparks were there, which I think leads for a better foundation anyway. So that's good too.
Yeah, I love that the original Jane Eyre where once they're courting and she's kind of always rapping his knuckles and saying, you're gonna behave. We're not sinking into this sentimentality. We're not doing dinners together until, that she really does kind of mind the line for him. And the idea too of making her the assistant. I worked in a firm once and there was a senior partner and he had a long-standing older assistant. And he came out of his office once, and these are like very powerful people within the firm, right? They hold the client, they hold part of the firm. And I saw a scene once where he came out and his assistant said to him, where are you going? And he said, I'm going for coffee. And she said, did you email, X, Y, and Z yet? And he said, no. And he turned around and went back into his office. And I thought that was just such a cute little scene. And that kind of contributed to me thinking that's what Jane would be doing to Rochester there, because that's kind of how she runs him once they're courting.
I think one of the characters that is always the one we get snagged on when we think about the idea of a modern adaptation, that you, I think, did a really great job of keeping the sort of plot element while changing the character pretty significantly, is the character of Julie versus Bertha, and kind of what the role that she plays in the story versus what that means to a modern audience. Like it's just really different. So I'm curious as to kind of how you landed there.
That one, when I set out to write this, that was the real sticking point. And I think I wrote the reveal of the wife as one of the last scenes I did. She was really tough to do. And I went over it like half a dozen times, trying to really just, it felt very surgical in the writing of that and having to be so precise. I didn't want to go down the mental health route. I just feel that's one of those things that don't translate. Their understanding of mental health back then so radically different from ours. You really can't contextualize it in a modern setting. And so this is one of those things where I was like, I can pull different things out of this interaction. But what I chose to do is I went back to the original novel and the scene where it's revealed to Jane that he has this wife and that she has lost her mind and that she lives up in the attic, the ultimate gothic element. Was the part where Jane is shaming him for despising her, which is a very modern sensibility of mental health aspect, again, of Jane saying, she cannot help that she is mad, like the shame that you would speak of her thus. Something like that. And Rochester comes back and he says, then you don't understand how I love it all. If you lost your mind, Jane, like, I'd love you despite of it. I'd take care of you. You'd have no caretaker but me. Your every waking moment would be me looking after you. And then he says, the reason I despise my wife is, and what he really goes on to explain is, I despised who she was when she was sane. So the loss of her healthy mentality, it makes no difference to me. The loss of her sanity makes no difference. He said she was unfaithful. She was an alcoholic. she did this, and that she lied to me on these number of things. And then he hates himself too, because I didn't really know her. She was just presented to me as a bride, and I was such a fool that I just went and took her. And then when I realized who I was, I realized we'd never have a happy marriage. That all predates her mental health problems. So when I created the character of Julie in the book, I'm like, that's what I'm going to go for. She ended up married to someone that he does not respect, that he does not think well of, and that he does not like. And the only plot element I need to keep is the fact that he can't divorce her. And that can be for any number of reasons. I don't need him to be, I'm tied to her because she can't consent to a divorce. I just need it to be, I'm stuck in a marriage with someone I never loved and never esteemed. So that's kind of how I molded it to the best of my ability. And so I'm like, great, let's get some interesting financial and legal ramifications for why he cannot divorce her. Because we're in a law firm, so why not?
Yeah. I have to say, when she was like, because I kept wondering, I was like, okay, who is it going to be? Like another partner? Is it going to be like a secret? Like just trying to figure out what we know about the story and how it would apply to the setting. So like I'm like guessing things as I'm reading through your book. And the one thing that like kept sticking in my brain is when Jade is getting the initial tour on her first day, and she's talking about like the multiple floors that that they have in this skyscraper, and that they refer to the top floor as like the attic, quote unquote. And I was like, is she going to be like a mysterious bookkeeper up in the attic space, the accountant? And I was like, what is this going to be? So it was very fun to like try and guess. So then to have a lady off in California, I was like, oh, not what I thought was going to happen, but it's good. It's a good surprise.
Great, a bookkeeper in the attic. I love that. Someone in the accounting department. That would have been so much fun. Yeah. No, I put her out in California just because, the threat coming for an original book, Mason and the others, is always coming from Jamaica and people who knew about Jamaica. So I wanted it to be somewhere out of country, off scene, and I also wanted because California has very different property laws. So that was useful too, and because they were having their fires, their forest fires, and I'm like, great, fire. That works. Getting down Brookfield.
That is honestly, when you started referencing the forest fires, I was like, oh my God, is Bertha gonna die in the forest fire? Because that's a little rough to like. And then you made her like one of those people who's at it, because I have a lot of family who lives in California, in areas where they've had to evacuate because of forest fires before. And so I was like, that's a little dark to just kill her in a forest fire. And then you were like, she refused to evacuate, and I was like, then she should burn.
Well, with so many things too, like the fact that the whole like the fire drill scene that they have is what gets Jane and Edward in the stairwell, where they have their like proposal confrontation, like kind of admittance of feelings kind of moment. And so when you first started talking about the fire drills and everything, I was like, is the skyscraper gonna burn down? I was like, what's gonna happen? It was so funny to imagine how possibly extreme this could be. But no, it was wonderful. A wonderful little way to keep us guessing.
Yeah, I put in a couple of red herrings for fire. I had the fire drill in the forest. I thought I'd just leave a couple in there, and one of these will turn out by the time I'm finished writing.
I love them.
I'm glad as someone who has family in California, and I hope they've always been safe, that you were okay with how I did that, because we also have forest fires out in BC a lot. And you always see these things in the news of like the long stream of cars that are evacuating. And then always some rando who's like driving straight in and like, no, there's a pizza there. And I really want to get that pizza. And you're like, what are you doing? So I'm like, all right, that's going to be Bertha, and she's going to face the consequences of her choices.
Yeah, I think it's something that's so inherently selfish, and you painted this very selfish character. And there's people who die in forest fires because they can be fast moving, they change directions. There's lots of terrible things that can happen that are absolutely not your fault. But if they tell you to evacuate and you don't, not only are you putting yourself at risk, but you're also putting a lot of other people at risk. And that is so unbelievably selfish to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and selfishness is the theme of that character, so I'm glad that came across.
Yeah.
And
it fit really well.
Can we just say that Julie was attending that gender reveal party that set California on fire that one time. She was the one who set off the cannon.
There has been more than one gender reveal party to start forest fires, by the way. Isn't that a huge bummer?
They end in disaster. You know what? I think, I don't know if I've been allowed to get away with that, but that would be a really great dark comedy version of Jane Eyre.
They're like, no, Julie, we're not allowed to do that. She's like, it's a pie.
That would be great. I
oh
love
my
that.
goodness.
What were you going to say, Piper?
Oh, nothing. I was just recovering from
Just
my giggles.
sighing. Okay.
Just sighing with joy.
Another character that I don't know how you did it, because I hate St. John so much. And the way that you captured that, like, there's so many parallels between Rochester and St. John, and there's so many characters between your Edward and Daniel, but the way they make me feel is so different. And it's those subtle differences. And you had those parallels in there so well. And I hated Daniel. He was so infuriating. So I'm curious as to how, like, he has a similar power dynamic with her. He has a similar level of, like, perceived respect for her, but there's these little differences in the way he talks to her and the way he treats her as a person that takes time to click in, because she does see him as this friend. And I'm curious as to how you made me hate him so much.
I'm so glad you hated him with all your heart. That's fantastic. St. John's a complicated character. He really is. But I'm kind of going back to what we were talking about before, you know, with Rochester, where he says awful things, but he actually does nice things for people. I kind of looked at St. John as the reverse of that, where he says all the right things. And again, I go back to the example of someone who says, I care about the environment, I care about this, and then you have to say, what are your actual actions? You can say all the party lines, but show me the proof, show me the evidence. And so with St. John, with the Daniel character, that's how I approached it. So he's going to say all the right things to begin with, and then you're kind of going to get the turn. And how I perceive St. John in the novel is that he's not malicious. He's just so cold and calculating for his higher cause that he looks at Jane as utilitarian. She is a tool for his use. She's clever and she's competent. So when I moved her to that academic setting, I'm like, right. So I'm going to have an academic who's all about the pure academia and the career goals, and say, she's got these uses and I will shape her to my will. And the thing about the Jane Eyre character in the original is always that she's so outwardly compliant, that when she kind of snaps, as she does with her aunt, as she does with St. John, as she kind of does Lilwood, people are always shocked. People did not see it coming. She's got a very long burning fuse on her temper, and then it goes. And so what I think that happens is that people like St. John, who want to make use of other people, and again, not in the way we typically think of someone being a user, but someone who just looks around as everything is a utilitarian tool, looks at someone like Jane and says, oh, she's compliant, she's controlled, okay, perfect, I can shape her, she'll understand this mission, she's logical like me, and then you get the snap. But I wanted to do it subtly because, again, that's one of those power dynamics in the 19th century doesn't really work so well anymore, that she would be taking instruction from him. So I just thought, make him a little bit older, make him a little further in the academic career, that there's a genuine reason for her to be learning from him. And then to make him dismissive of her studies is, I think, was an easy thing to do. Because I studied literature in my undergrad, and I certainly got remarks of, what are you going to do? Go work at the English factory. And even now, you know, writing these women's fictions novels and the way people can discount them, because they deal with these, you know, I'm going to make air quotes, softer issues of relationships and drawing room scenes and things like that. And that they really do have gravitas and substance. Like, the female writers are incredibly important. Look how Jane Eyre has survived. It's amazing. Devoted 2 years to it. It's brilliant. I love that. So what I wanted to do was kind of take this commonality of, a lot of us love these women writers, modern and past, and just have someone dismiss them and dismiss their studies and dismiss, you know, the social sciences and the arts and things like that, which happens a lot. And I think that's probably why we all have the rage reaction to Daniel, because he's so logical about it. He doesn't come out and just be a jerk and say, this is ridiculous. He's just like, well, no, that's great. You're doing these studies. But if you really want to be taken seriously,
Oh my God.
Just pivot yourself over here to my way of thinking, and then you'll be fine.
Well, and it's such a classic male, like it's such a nice guy trope, like such a classic male way to be like dismissing her because she's too passionate about it. Because women being passionate is immediately a negative thing. She's too emotional in her interpretations of Emily Dickinson, which like, I don't know what you're talking about. And then telling her not to study Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte, which I did love. Your little, that was like my favorite little reference of the story when you were like, I've been living a Bronte story. I'm like, you have. But I think it's just such a specific person. It's one of the things we talk about a lot with Charlotte Bronte's characters is that they feel that three-dimensional, as you referenced, because they're real. Like we all know someone like Brocklehurst. We all know someone like Aunt Reed. And they're so awful because they're so real. And it felt the same. Like there was something about Daniel that was like, I know this. I went to college with this man who I had a guy in one of my classes try to explain to me why I should take feminism more seriously. Because I talk about it really sarcastically. And I was like, I'm going to need you to take
feminism.
I'm going to need you to take some big steps back and appreciate the irony of this moment with me, or I'll have to kill you.
If we can talk about speaking of feminism, one thing that I really enjoyed, I think probably my favorite part of this, was when they had, Lillian and I always say that the heart of an adaptation comes down to the stay scene, and how he's going to like defend himself. But it's also that pivotal moment. It's one of Jane's strongest moments of being like, I love you and I understand the situation, but I'm leaving for these reasons. And what we've often talked about that I think you also captured really well in this like modern day, like take of her, Jane's kind of struggle is like, well, there's this element of self-respect. Like you lied to me and you like did so for a very long time. But then also I really appreciated one thing that you brought it to that was important for her is this idea of not just like the trust and that kind of thing, but like the security of being with him legitimately. I thought that was so interesting to think about in this modern setting of her being like, it's not just like a petty thing like, oh, you can like, buy me nice things. It's if I loved that you talked about specifically the hospital thing where it's like, if you get hurt, your wife makes the calls. I can't do that for you. And coming from this like unstable like background of having like lost her father and all this other stuff, I thought that was a brilliant way to like bring that into a great argument. Because otherwise, normally, yeah, I feel like we could just be like, okay, if we can get over the lying part, which freaking sucked, then yes, we can live together and we don't have to be married. It's the modern age. But I loved that reasoning. I thought that was great.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, that was tough to write because again, it's one of those modern translation issues where, back in the highly moral time of Jane Eyre, it makes sense. He's a married man. We immediately understand all the ostracization that will follow and all the sin and blah, 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 blah. And in modern day parlance, a lot of us are like, well, is it that big of a deal? Like a wedding would be nice, but, a lot of people cohabitate and they'll have so, and then the flip side of that, I need the security of marriage is I was really worried about taking Jane too much into materialism, where it sounds like she won't marry him because she can't have the status symbol of the ring and this and that. And so that's where I really played on to, again, going back into the original text where he says, you wouldn't offend anyone by living by me. Like, who do you have around? And she's like, I must respect myself. So I went into that scene thinking it's about her self-respect. And I'm going to play heavily on the fact that she has not had any security growing up since she was 13. And so it's not materialism to demand that of a partner. These are the basic, things at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, right? Food, water, shelter. This is what I require. And if I'm living off your money and we have no legal ties, and yeah, if you're in a hospital, if there's a will, I have no legal recourse to access you as your partner in this life, and so all that stability falls away. So it was really hard to walk that line for a modern woman who just, I have my own career, I have my own assets, and so I had to put my head into someone who's coming with no assets and that inequality. And I do think some modern couples do struggle with that. If he owns a condo or she owns a condo and the other person's renting, and you're going to cohabitate and giving up their lease, versus are you going to have, various things. Are we moving countries for your job or for my job? Who owns more with the job? Am I going on your benefits plan? There is a lot of that in a long-term relationship. And so I just kind of tried to fast forward ahead to, I will not have any of these things. I can't be on your benefits. You can't be on mine. I can't get to the hospital. What rights will the children have? And tried to bring that very legal sense to building a life together under threat, as opposed to marriage being a moral sense or a materialistic sense.
And with them, with their law background, I mean, it also makes sense from that stance that she would have those thoughts. But yeah, I thought it was handled really well. And I loved bringing that into it, because that is kind of a tricky thing to navigate. So well done.
I'm glad it came across okay. That was another scene I went over a couple of times, really like finite on the language.
Yeah, it was really, really well done. There was a few, I feel like sometimes when I'm reading anything at this point, because there's so many references to Jane Eyre and like Taylor Swift songs and like other places that are surprising, but particularly reading this book, it's sort of like catching your favorite song lyrics in something where like there's little quotes where I'm like, hey, that's from Jane Eyre. And then I'll remind myself, like, that's the whole book, Sweet Pea. The whole book is from Jane Eyre. But I caught that a lot. There were a few very, very subtle and wonderful, like when you reveal that it's called Lowood University. I was like,
If it makes you feel better, my agent did the exact same thing. So when I didn't have an agent when I wrote this book, so I sent it off to have it as an agent. The couple got back to me, and my agent Melissa, who I adore, got back to me. And when she was on the phone with me the first time we were talking about signing, she goes, "It's Jane Eyre, right?" Because I was reading through, and about halfway through, I'm like, wait a minute. So that's the kind of line I wanted to walk, though. We say it's not quite a retelling, it's a reimagining. It's a lovely way you put it. It's got all your favorite song lyrics, referring to something as the attic, but it's not listening to the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I thought it was really well done in a way that, to be totally honest, when I was reading those first few chapters, I was like, I might actually have a problem with this. The way that, to stick with the song, the way that like a cover of your favorite song sounds a little different, and you're like, oh, I don't know that I'm going to enjoy this. And it took me a little bit into it. You did too good of a job immediately for me of making the boss be like an actually shitty boss. First, like when she first meets Mr. I was like, I have worked with people like this and I don't enjoy them. And it took me a minute to get through that part. So what I'm saying is you're too good of a writer, and if you could be a little worse so that I was less emotionally invested, I would appreciate it in the future.
Thank you so much.
One of my, and I don't know if you have more wrap-up questions, but one thing that I'm curious about as kind of like a wrap-up, since you mentioned earlier, Melodie, that you had lots of ideas about ways to adapt this and you could have written 6 versions in the modern day, I would love to know, what is like a concept that you left on the cutting room floor?
I went into a big thing of much more time at the university, and confronting the publishers of her father's book, and going into that. I wanted Jane to I was kind of getting into like a financial thriller, and I'm like, that's not what Jane Eyre is. Leave that alone. And I definitely had that. I cut a lot more time in the law firm explaining how a law firm works. And it became too much of like a how-to manual of a law firm works, which again, you pare it down to what is Jane Eyre. But I really liked, in the original novel, Jane becoming a teacher and the ecosystem of Lowood, and then Jane moving, how she's going to get a job at Thornfield and how that all works, and the board of trustees coming in and overlooking Lowood and stuff. And so I tried to bring a lot more of those elements into the law firm. And really what it was is, I've worked in 4 different law firms, and here's everything I know downloaded. Which might be interesting, but does not necessarily serve the character. And I always tried to par back to what serves Jane's emotional journey. And I definitely had harsher people in the law firm. And it's funny you talk about like those early scenes of like, I'm not enjoying revisiting my own worst work episodes, which is a really good note to have, because I worked in a very cutthroat corporate world, and I kind of normalized it. And so I was writing this out. Some people were saying, this would never be allowed to happen in a modern workplace. I'm like, really? Because I've seen it happen.
Yeah. I think that's what was bothering me, was I was like, this fully could happen in a modern workplace. And it does bother me when it does happen.
So I didn't want to re-traumatize anyone, and I didn't want to discourage the firms too much. It isn't any one firm I worked at. I worked at a number of them. I had colleagues who went on to work in other firms, and there's many wonderful things about those firms. I worked in them for 8 years. It's just when I wanted a gothic, spooky Thornfield, I'm like, I'm going to pull the worst out of these experiences and make it into this, house of horrors that Thornfield is when she discovers all the secrets behind it. So it's a tough one.
Gothic corporate Canada. Well, I honestly, we could probably talk to you all day, but that would be a long episode and a lot of your time. So we have to cut ourselves off at some point. Before we go into some things that we have, first of all, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us. It's been such a blast. But I also know you have a new book coming out. I believe, is it coming out? Is it already out, or is it coming out in the new year?
It's coming out in the new year. It's out at the end of February.
Okay. We did talk about that. I totally forgot. I'm just very spacey. But tell us a little bit about this new book that you have. We've gotten to see the cover because you gave us a little sneak peek. And it has a very similar vibe, which we enjoy, but it is a different reimagining of Persuasion, correct?
Yes. I flipped over to Jane Austen this time, and I did my favorite Austen, which is Persuasion. And I did another Canadian setting, so I took it to a place called Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is right near the American border. And it's a lovely place that exists in real life. And it's like a small town, but it's also a historical village like Colonial Williamsburg. But it's also kind of a luxury playground, and there's lots of spas and things like that. So I did another modern reimagining where I took Anne and I took Wentworth, and I said, what are their characters? What are their emotional journeys? And then I'm going to have fun with that in this small Canadian town of Niagara-on-the-Lake. I love it a lot. Had a lot of fun writing it. And it's funny that you mentioned a Taylor Swift song when we were talking about Jane and Edward, because I actually did put a Taylor Swift playlist through this new book.
Yes.
I have a friend of Anne saying, I'm going to give you a breakup playlist, and here's the Taylor Swift songs. And so then I had the fun of going through the Taylor Swift canon, picking out all the songs that I thought would apply to Anne Elliot and Ben Wentworth, and then I make her listen to it throughout the novel. So that was fun.
That's awesome.
Incredible. So you can have a listening experience as well when you read. Listen along.
I'm convinced one similarity between you and Taylor Swift is that you both were spending a lot of time thinking about Jane Eyre during the pandemic, because there's a lot of Jane Eyre references in folklore. So that's just... what I'm trying to say is you and Taylor Swift, essentially the same person.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, I don't have billions. Okay, I'll take it.
Lillian, what's coming up next for us?
Well, next week we are going to be doing, so we're wrapping up our podcast. This is our last adaptation of Jane Eyre that we're going to be talking about. Actually, no, it might not be, but Piper and I have to talk about that off air. We might be watching part of a TV show that we found a pirated version on YouTube that isn't supposed to exist.
Okay. Secret additional adaptation. Sweet.
We next week are not going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about our final character study, Mr. Rochester. We saved him for last. We didn't do a Jane Eyre one because that is the whole podcast is a character novel. Study of Jane Eyre.
Yes, exactly.
So this is our last character study looking at Rochester. And I think, like a lot of our character studies, it's going to be a long boy, guys.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. So if you guys have enjoyed listening to this, it would be awesome if you leave a 5-star review. If you have thoughts that you guys want to share, you can reach out to us. We are at Airbuds on all social. And you can always reach out anytime at our email, airbuds@gmail.com.
Thank you again, Melodie, so much for coming on. I really appreciate the time that you've taken. It was a joy to get to read your book and to get to chat with you about all of it today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, because it's been so much fun to talk to Jane Eyre enthusiasts as well. I loved it.
Thank you so much. And yes, go find her book. Stay tuned for February when the new one comes out. But yeah, Melodie, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you both.
Are you going to do the little goodbye line, Piper?
Oh, I will do the goodbye line. Happy Jane Eyre reading and watching, everybody. We'll see you later.